Hello, one and all. Welcome back to the Brother Augustine podcast. I am your host, Michael, proprietor of the Brother Augustine podcast, author of the Amazon bestseller On the Masons and Their Lies. And today I have two guests instead of one. We're going to do something new here. They are Father Deacon Ananias Sorum, philosophy professor at Fullerton University. And I also have Jay Dyer. You may have seen me on his show in October of 2018 talking about the ancient mystery schools. He is the author of Esoteric Hollywood and Esoteric Hollywood 2. And gentlemen, welcome to the Brother Augustine podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Pleasure.
Absolutely. So guys, I wanted to invite you on because I heard rumor that you have written a book together. Is that true?
It's in the process.
In the process, yep. Mm-hmm.
We've got, I would say, maybe 5 chapters, full chapters complete. So I don't know. We don't have a set limit on how many chapters it'll be, but I mean, anyway, it could be 10, 15, somewhere in there. But we've got at least half of the book, I think, the material complete.
Very cool.
It could be a multi-volume set. We have
going
Here's
for the
the
church
first
father
half.
style.
Yeah, they're.
All you have to do is read these 38 volumes of our apologetic, and you'll know that God exists for sure. We've proven it.
Hey, there you go. Hey, the set looks nice. Nice little matching covers on the bookshelf, I'm sure. If yours becomes a series, hopefully we'll have the same kind of aesthetic going. So what's the book about, guys? I actually know nothing about it.
So
Father Deacon,
I'll give it like a brief introduction. So this idea came to me this summer. I was back in Michigan where our episcopate is, and I was teaching. They have like a senior high school camp, and I was invited to stay for 2 weeks and teach the kids, high school students, in the our Orthodox Romanian episcopate, apologetics. And so both Jay and I have done apologetics, and we share a kind of similar history. Now, although I come from, my educational background of learning like kind of Roman Catholic, scholastic and classical theism and natural theology arguments, having become Orthodox, started reading the Fathers and developing critiques of that project. Now, what's interesting, and I thought about Jay on this because we'd both shared a background. Jay had gone to Bonson University, and myself being trained when I was younger in what's known as presuppositional apologetics, which unfortunately is kind of been hijacked by the Reformed crew. However, as Jay has noticed and done a lot of videos on this too, that we started to see this methodology and type of argumentation in the church fathers in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And in stark contrast to the kind of philosophic project and apologetics that you see within scholasticism and Western Christianity. And so I actually went to the episcopate and started teaching the students some what are known presuppositional apologetics and transcendental arguments. And as I was working through their objections, they're really smart students too. I'd reached out to Jay and I'm like, you know what? There's really not that many people in the Orthodox Church other than familiar with what's called transcendental arguments or presuppositional apologetics. And that's basically when I got the idea that, Jay, why don't we write a book, even though these ideas are implicit in the argumentation and the style, and the apologetics is implicit within the fathers, let's explicate this in a very explicit way in terms of what's called transcendental arguments and presuppositional apologetics. And so it was this summer that Jay and I got the idea, and Jay thought it was a great idea. So that's kind of the origins of where this inspiration for writing the book began.
Okay, so your audio cut out a little bit, but is this the guy you were talking about, Father Joshua
that's the
Schubing?
book. Yeah, you got it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So just to give maybe a definition to people who might not know, When you say presuppositional arguments, what exactly would that mean in layman's terms? No pun intended.
Yeah, Jay, you want to take this, and then I'll take the latter half.
Yeah, basically, it's a little bit of a counterintuitive type of argumentation, but nevertheless, it is still a valid form of logical argumentation. So we're doing apologetics, and we're presenting an argument, but it's just not an argument that has the classical form that most arguments have. For example, if you go to Aquinas, in his different proofs, he'll say things like, if we look at causation has to, go back to some first cause. That's a classical type of argument that's used for a first mover, kind of borrowing pretty much from Aristotle. What we're saying is that it's not that causation is not a valid thing operant in the world, or that teleology purpose isn't a valid thing that exists in the world. What we're saying is that even before we begin to talk about teleology or causation, there are prior commitments that everybody has. Everybody has what we call a paradigm or a worldview. And that's pretty much the most basic philosophic commitments that we have by which we read the world. It's kind of like our lenses that we see everything through. And so in philosophy, sometimes it's called a worldview, as I said, a paradigm. And for argumentation, for philosophy, we speak of epistemology, we speak of ethics, and we speak of metaphysics. These are the three branches of philosophy. Classic philosophy, I think, would pretty much agree on this. Not much dispute there that that's what makes up a worldview. And so what we're saying is that everybody has pre-commitments, presuppositions, transcendental categories that they are adhering to, even if they're not immediately aware of it, before they begin to do any argumentation, logic, apologetics, ethical movements, whatever they're trying to do with their argumentation. There's pre-commitments. And so what we're doing is we're saying, hold on a minute here with this first cause argument. Let's step back and let's look at the pre-commitments. Let's look at the transcendental categories that are actually prior to, metaphysically and epistemically, prior to these kinds of classical arguments. And let's see if there's a stronger argument that actually moves us in the direction of the Orthodox conception of who God is. We could speak of the way St. Maximus does as a natural proof of the Trinity. And he actually uses that. I'll show that here in a minute, where he says that nature itself, because the content of nature is the logi, they actually point us directly to the logos. And so our apologetic needs to be consistent with our theology. And if we don't hold to natural theology in the way that Thomism does, for example, then we're going to need an argumentation that's more consistent with our approach to critiquing worldviews. And so put simply, a pre-commitment is just something that is the presuppositions that we have by which we do anything, whether it's making an argument or whether it's even something mundane like going to the bank, right? I mean, all of these things presuppose a kind of a world, a certain type of world, a world that's structured in a certain way. And our argument is that these pre-commitments, these presuppositions, they actually point us to the triune God.
Interesting. Jay, I watched, or I should say tried to watch, several months ago, you had a debate with some vegan guy, and it sounds like from your description of presuppositions, it was the clash of presuppositions that kind of stopped the whole debate from going forward at all.
We couldn't even have a debate because before that debate happened, the guy said, before we went live on the, when we were just talking on Skype, he said, I'm not going to debate you on anything presuppositional or meta-ethical or metaphysical. I'm like, that's what I'm here to debate. Like, I can't have a debate with you. So the whole debate was about whether we could have a debate. It was the most maddening thing. And I will say, please don't use that as like my exemplar debate, because it was very frustrating, very silly. I think that was about maybe a year and a half ago. But more recently, the debate with Matt Dillahunty, the well-known atheist, that one actually turned out a lot better because we were able to hone in a very specific way in terms of where he wasn't getting the argument and why his argument for skepticism, I think, failed. And then most recently, the debate with Stefan Molyneux was this very point as well, that transcendental argumentation, ironically, is something that he was doing in his books, what he was calling self-detonating arguments, and not realizing that he was actually hitting on the very thing that we're trying to argue for.
Interesting. So the way this book is set up, is there a particular audience that you're hoping to convert to Orthodoxy, or is it more a training in apologetics? Or what would you say is the stated aim of what you're writing? Who are you trying to reach?
Ideally, both. I think we want to try to do both. it's not going to appeal to a person who isn't already perhaps a little open-minded. I mean, if a person is a committed atheistic skeptic, it's not, I don't think, going to necessarily convince them, because as we know, as Orthodox, it's not just a matter of intellect. That is what conversion is. Conversion is actually metanoia. It's repentance. And as St. Joseph Popovich says, we can't interpret the natural world even correctly without repentance. And so the nous has to be cleansed. There has to be that opening, which is a work of grace, which requires, the willingness on the part of the person, for sure. But insofar as we want to do apologetics consistently with the way the fathers do apologetics, I view apologetics as kind of a sign pointer, right? It's kind of an aid that we can put out there to help move people to conversion. Obviously, apologetics itself doesn't convert anybody. But so ideally, we'd like to appeal to both crowds. But I'll mention some of the chapters that we have. But Father Deacon, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, something that's also important in apologetics is being able to, as Father Joshua Shuping points out, with St. Irenaeus talks about things in terms of systems, which is what we would say is a paradigm or worldview, and that the Christian apologetics is system destroying, smashing the systems. Now that might sound pretty rough, but the idea is that, again, the ultimate aim of apologetics is for conversion, not, again, as Jay had pointed out, an argument converts someone. But what's really interesting, especially about this, what's so successful about this type of apologetics, is it's removing people's excuses. So if we have certain atheists or skeptics raising, and oftentimes very sophisticated, at least in the terms of philosophical arguments, this is extremely successful and a crushing blow. And to remove the obstacle, such as Romans says, they are without excuse, and these sorts of apologetics and methods will demonstrate that they, in fact, all are without excuse, because the glory of God and His powers are manifest. It's just the mind's and its rebellion suppresses what is so clearly evident, the existence of God. And so part of this apologetics is to remove and answer anything that could be used as, what's the scripture? We are to take hold of every thought that sets itself up against the pretense of, and I wish I had that up, and make every thought obedient to God. So no, I remember what it says. We demolish every argument that sets itself up against the pretenses of God, and we make obedient and captive every thought to Jesus Christ. And so this is really ultimately at the very heart of presuppositional arguments and apologetics.
Very cool. So is the book kind of going through, is it kind of through atheist arguments and Protestants and Catholics and pagans, and are you going through the whole scope of people whose thoughts are not captive to God, and explaining why their presuppositions don't lead them in the correct direction? Is that kind of the idea?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Father Deacon has this is just kind of a rough outline. He's written a really excellent essay on apophaticism, which I think shows that the apophatic approach to theology that Orthodoxy has, that stresses, is actually more consonant with a transcendental argument, because the transcendental argument is an argument from the impossibility of the contrary. It's an argument that's a reductio. It's an argument basically saying that without God, the world is nonsense. It's absurd. It's nihilistic. It's basically chaos. And there's no reason for any reasoning at all if God doesn't exist. God is the reason for reasoning. And so if God doesn't exist, and a specific type of God doesn't exist, then what we get is a world that is meaningless, and therefore all argumentation, which presupposes meaning, is pointless. You see. So these are the kind of movements that we'll be making, but. So he kind of kicks off. I mean, this is just a rough outline of what I'm seeing so far developing. with apophatic theology and argumentation. And then he's got an excellent essay on natural theology and how Orthodox theology doesn't line up with the Thomistic project of natural theology. And some of the most famous Orthodox of the 20th century, as I said, Father Justin Popovich in his famous essay on St. Isaac the Syrian points out how we can't adopt Thomistic natural theology. Father Staniloy in Volume 1, he begins the work by saying that we don't adhere to Thomistic natural theology, and he points out that the natural revelation theology of St. Maximus is clearly in contrast to this notion of Thomism. So we will be dealing with that in the Roman Catholic sphere, because at the same time I'm also presently doing a book for Father Peter Heers for his publishing company, Uncut Mountain, which will be a critique of the Roman Catholic Thomistic position. So both my book and the book that we're doing with Father Deacon are going to be relevant and touching on the same spheres. The next chapter, I have an essay that I think is going to be really good about numbers, and how numbers are a great example of something that's an immaterial, invariant, abstract entity that really only makes sense if we have the God of Orthodoxy. So I'm going to be arguing that numbers prove God. Father Deacon has another essay. I have another essay, I should say, about this one gets a little hairy, a little difficult, but when we go through the atheist objections to the argument that we present, a lot of times we're seeing patterns and consistent objections come up that we want to address. And one of those is, well, how do you know that this proves an actual God that exists? And how do you know that you're not just constructing this big mental argument and it's all purely conceptual, but it doesn't actually apply to the real world? Mm-hmm. And so I have a chapter that I'm tweaking where I want to address that one of the transcendental categories that we're positing here that we have to assume is a commonly experienced external world, right? And if the Christian worldview is true, that is obviously part of the Christian worldview, right? God created a world that we commonly experience, and the world is structured such that we can have meaningful experience of the world. And so that's part of the argument. So the argument is not just something, this is a big misunderstanding people have, it's not just something rational or conceptual. I can think of a God, like Anselm's, ontological argument. So that's not what we're doing. That's not the project that we're engaged in. What we're engaged in is something even more radical and apophatic than that, and saying it's not a God of the highest conception that you have. It's a God who has revealed himself to us beyond human conceptions, right? And so in that sense, any logic, any reasoning, any predication at all presupposes the existence of the Christian God. So by the very fact of an atheist trying to argue, trying to make sentences, trying to do ethics, he's presupposing not just a generic God, our God. And that is a nuclear strength argument. If in fact the argument holds, I think it holds. I think it's a sound argument. And that's what we're going to try to demonstrate, is that it is a sound argument. So that's kind of how it's fleshing itself out so far. I'm sure we'll probably have to have a chapter addressing some of the Thomistic claims. I mean, Father Deacon's chapter on natural theology pretty much, I think, addresses the root of the problem with natural theology, which is that it's based in an older model of empiricism that comes out of Aristotle. And one thing that it helps to understand, which Father Deacon can comment on this, is that there's a dialogue of history of ideas. And so we can't always jump back to something in the medieval world or the ancient world and assume that it's a valid argument because it's an old argument, right? You actually see this with both atheists and Christians today. Unfortunately, they will appeal to, let me show you some of these medieval cosmological arguments, right? Or the atheists, in response to them, will appeal to Enlightenment era figures who doubt those kinds of arguments as well. So what I would say is that we need to be aware of the movement of history, and that in the ancient medieval world, you didn't have people questioning presuppositions consistently. There is some of this. Aristotle in Book 4 of Metaphysics has a transcendental argument. John of Damascus, actually, is the first that I'm aware of to explicitly appropriate a transcendental argument for, at a paradigm level, for the absurdity of denying philosophy or reasoning at all. And so he does that at the beginning of the philosophical chapters. He says that if I were to deny logic or philosophy at all, he said I would be using logic and philosophy to deny it, and therefore that would be an absurd position. So there is a patristic historic usage of transcendental arguments. I'm just trying to stress that if somebody were to say something like, well, where's the transcendental argument in St. Photius? Like, where does he lay out this syllogism? It doesn't work like that, because there's a process of history to within history of what kinds of questions and at what level questions are being asked. And in the ancient and medieval world, most of the time, people didn't question things at the paradigm level. In the history of Western philosophy, that becomes the obsession. After Descartes has basically dug down to what he thinks is the most basic assumption, the most properly basic belief, he thinks he's questioned everything through skepticism, right? Skepticism from Hume, Kant, becomes the obsession. And so they want to question everything. And so our apologetic response can't just be relying on old arguments that are not addressing the skeptical questions that are being asked, you see. And so we have to address the skepticism, and really only the transcendental argument does. That's why you can't just keep using like medieval Thomist arguments about causation, because you're talking to people who question causation, right? So a smart atheist can just say, I don't believe that there's causation.
And Jay, it's good that you bring that up, because one of the critiques that we get from Christians is that, well, wait a minute, this just looks like neo-Kantian modern philosophy being imputed retrospectively back into the fathers. And so I like what Jay just said there, is that, look, we can't just use the same exact arguments that they were using in antiquity, because the objections that are raised in terms of modern philosophy and in terms of the post-Kantian world are new objections. That's what the scripture means by to take every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And so I see nothing wrong with being able to, in fact, this last chapter that I did that Jay's talking about, the paper that I wrote, it pulls from a lot of modern epistemology and being able to critique certain modern epistemological projects as well as ancient, but also being able to pull and see the similarities that, look, here's where these people actually got something right. And we see this similar thing being argued, or the approach being similar in the fathers. So I know that's a concern. The other concern, too, is, again, people get just bogged down with names. Transcendental argument. I don't see that word in the fathers, right? Isn't this the same argument that we get that, well, the Trinity is not in the Bible, so I guess the concept doesn't exist. So what I'm looking for is the concept. I don't care about the word. Transcendental argument. That is a term first coined by Kant to say that, look, there are typically two types of argumentation: deductive arguments, in which a conclusion is said to follow or follow necessarily from the premises, and then inductive, which ends up being from experience, multiple experiences, then basically deriving a general claim, which are always probabilistic, but Kant identified, because he's starting to reflect back on terms of, and kind of meta-thinking, meta-logic, in terms of paradigms. Well, what makes possible logic and thinking at all? And then he says there's a third type of argument that you can have, which the conclusion is a necessary condition for the possibility of experience and thinking that's not established deductively, as the conclusion is derived from a deductive argument, but rather transcendentally, such that if this conclusion transcendentally, the transcendental conclusion, were not true, reasoning and experience would not be possible. Now, as soon as I hear that, and if you've been reading the Fathers, you start to realize, but they have the same idea, the same concept. that without God and without the presuppositions of divine revelation, man would not be in a position to know anything. You'd have an incoherent worldview. You wouldn't be able to account for knowledge and experience. And so what you see in the Fathers is, again, the name or argument might not be there, transcendental argument, but that line of thinking is definitely present. And so I think it's great. I think that just as you see in the ecumenical councils too, that, look, our doctrines don't develop. However, that doesn't mean that language doesn't become more precise, and it becomes more precise specifically to answer objections from the heretics. So why can't we use this? Why can't we take something that's like, well, there's something there that's good. Let's refine our language and our argumentation, because this spirit of apologetics is in the Fathers. So part of the book is to do that, to answer the objections, both to the atheist objections and the Christian objections too. Because again, primarily transcendental arguments and presuppositional apologetics get associated with Calvinist Reformed thought. And we want to say that, look, this is something different. They might have similarities, but again, don't get bogged down with the name. We're talking about the concept. So part of the book is to basically explain that, the differences, why in Reformed theology that won't even work. Go ahead, Jay.
Let me put a question to you guys before you continue, Jay.
Sure.
So just so, we're talking on a high level, I want to bring it down to earth a little bit, see if I can get a kind of a practical example of what you're talking about. So let's start with the very bottom of the totem pole, which is a lot of people in the West, especially if they've been influenced by some kind of New Age or occult philosophy, wouldn't even agree with Jay with what you said earlier, that external reality exists at all. A lot of them are solipsists. They believe, I believe that. I think we talked about this on our show back in the day, where a lot of people's presupposition, one would say, is that they are creating the world with their own thoughts and words, and that nothing exists outside of their own immediate experience. So that being what I would consider the bottom of the totem pole, how would you refute that using the methodology that you guys are writing and talking about?
That's a great question. I would say that is one of the easiest things to refute, because if you start with that as your basic belief and then you start to question and flesh that out and to see if that's consistent, it's actually completely self-refuting. So to say that reality is purely a projection of my mind, it's the only thing that exists is mental phenomena, or that my mental states are the only thing that I know are real. There's variations on this kind of worldview, this idea. They all are essentially attributing or assuming multiple things that you could critique. One would be that there is a I that's a transcendental, we could say, or a subject that's there that is the unifying, underlying haver of these experiences, right? A self, right? Now, that might sound similar to Descartes, but it's not. Okay, so let's set Descartes aside, because I'm gonna make a different argument here. So, are you an external experience? What is the underlying self that's actually the unifier of these experiences? It's not something that you ever directly experience. You, right, the self, right? You can say, "Oh, I have a picture, I have a videotape recording of." No, that's not you, though. That's an icon, an image of you. It's not identical to you. So it's begging the question to say that I'm only going to believe in, like the external stimuli or the external phenomena, or that all that exists is an external projection of my psyche. Well, when you say when you say psyche, when you say mind, those are never things that are directly experienced. So you're assuming that there is an underlying subject, a unity of apperception is what Kant calls it, which we don't have to use those fancy terms. He's just talking about a self, a me and I, right? What is that? How do you know what that is? What is the basis for believing in that? There's not really a basis. It's just assumed. So when I start to dig down into this view, this belief, we start to see that it's not actually very coherent. It's actually resting on huge assumptions, right? It's resting on the assumption that the many phenomena of experience, even if you think they're just projections of your mind, these phenomena that you're experiencing, are they unified in some way? Like, does one relate to the other? Doesn't the ability to make sentences and to say true things about the world, even if you think the world is just a projection of your mind, doesn't that assume that there's some sort of objective standard of meaning, that things from the past relate to things in the future? So you have another classic problem of philosophy of the identity of objects over time, right? Like, how do we have this the view that the you as the baby is the same you as an adult, right? The tree that you saw yesterday is the same tree that you're seeing in your yard today, right? That's an assumption of philosophy that cannot be empirically determined. So any position that results in or boils itself down to radical empiricism or radical autonomy, that the human mind is the beginning point of knowledge and epistemology and perception, will always fall into radical skepticism and always become self-refuting, because all it has as its reference point is itself, and it can't even explain or ground what a self is. So that's a pretty devastating critique right there. Not to mention all the other areas that we could get into, like, well, so is logic a projection of your mind? It's something that you create? Well, it doesn't seem like, you can like alter logic from your mind. I mean, you could sit there and meditate all day long, right? Be like, the law of non-contradiction no longer applies. It no longer applies. 2 + 2 is now 5. But it doesn't seem to happen, right? That doesn't seem to manifest, right? So there's a lot of ways that you could critique this and show that it's self-refuting, not just contradictory, but it actually destroys the possibility of knowledge to have those kinds of solipsistic worldviews. And lastly, I would say the most devastating critique you could have of that kind of a position would be to say, well, if everything is merely a projection of my psyche, it kind of seems like, and a lot of people who have that view would kind of say, well, everything's illusory. Right? And so we're living in a dream state, bro. Like everything's just kind of like a trip, like we're in an acid trip. It's a dream. It's all just like, the Matrix or whatever. If everything in our experience, all the phenomena are illusory, then the truth that everything is a phenomena of illusion is also an illusion, you see.
Yeah, totally.
And so it's thus self-refuting at a fundamental level.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as you were talking, where if someone were to say that solipsism is the objective truth, they're already admitting that there is an objective truth that's outside of them, that there's a standard that they're applying to their own projections, and really kind of defeating their own argument to begin with. And I guess if you really wanted to flesh it out, you'd almost say, okay, if everything is a projection of your mind, then you yourself would have to be a projection of someone else's mind, and there's really kind of no end to where that would go.
Just a couple points to maybe remove confusion, and I know Father Deacon can extrapolate on this and say it a lot better than I could, because he's got a good multiple diagrams and kind of examples he's done. But what I would put forward is, if we wanted to kind of lay this out in a logical way, if you speak of necessary preconditions, this is what we mean by these sort of transcendental categories or arguments. If we say X is the necessary condition of Y, this is a really strong type of argument. It's a much stronger argument than the types of maybe empirical arguments that you would have like in a courtroom. Like, well, I saw Bill Cosby with the date rape drug, and he put it in the glass of, Bubba Cola before he gave it to the girl. And therefore, so this is different because that kind of a thing could easily be wrong or true. And it doesn't shake anyone's paradigm. But if we start getting to issues where the necessary preconditions of knowledge themselves, like logic, for example, is a necessary precondition for reasoning or logic, right? If we start denying that, then we're in a lot more trouble, right? This is devastating to one's entire paradigm, is what I'm trying to say. If we say, well, I don't believe in logic, right? So a necessary precondition. And if we look at it that way and we say X is a necessary precondition of Y, therefore X. So that's a really simple version of a transcendental argument that Father Deacon has put.
Yeah, why don't you just put a plug in some just for the audience, because that might be too abstract. What we mean by necessary conditions. So suppose Y stands for cake, and you're going to have to think about, like, well, what are the kind of bare ingredients that I have to have in order to have cake? That without which you ain't going to have any cake.
Yeah.
You could say eggs, butter, flour. So that would stand for X. So that means if there is cake, there are at least the things,
the necessary
eggs,
ingredients, right?
Yeah. So you can think about knowledge in the same way, because, I mean, everybody just takes it for granted. I mean, how many things in life do we take for granted? And
As
nobody
we've learned
kind of
this week,
reflects.
a lot.
Yeah, that's right. nobody kind of analyzes or reflects. Part of the problem is because people aren't that introspective. But, well, what makes that possible? Such that if these things weren't, the bare necessary ingredients weren't there, we wouldn't have knowledge. And what we find is that to be coherent and consistent, because we all want to be coherent and consistent, that there's only one unique condition that satisfies that. I mean, can, for example, molecules bouncing around in kind of a random chance order make things and account for as necessary ingredients for knowledge?
No.
Things that are universal, invariant, abstract, it doesn't make any sense. I'd be like saying that, I presuppose my necessary ingredients for cake is water, and that's it. Well, it doesn't make any sense. How do you get the sort of thing that has some sort of rigidity or sponginess out of something that's
Bill Cosby's
fluid?
roofies,
Yeah.
And then you get a perfect kind of cake for your date, a date cake.
That has a certain kind of cake.
It's a date cake rate. So
Lord
that's
have
just to bring
mercy.
it home to, that's just to kind of like bring it down. But as Jay's point out,
so the way I would put this here is my argument, since we have in the case of the cake y therefore x, I would say if we wanted to apply this to Christianity, the Christian worldview, the argument is just simply that the Christian worldview is the necessary precondition of knowledge, ethics, metaphysics, whatever. And so my X is the entire Christian worldview / God.
So basically what you've done is you've taken that line from the Triumph of Orthodoxy service where we say this is the faith that has established the universe, and you're turning that into an apologetic method.
Absolutely. The Synodochian.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And what we like about this argument that you see in the Fathers, where in Orthodoxy, and they had a problem with this with the Greek pagan philosophers, and the West embraced this philosophic project, is the sort of arguments that you get in kind of classical theism and natural theology is a generic God. It's a deistic, a Masonic God. This kind of causal impersonal force. But when you read the Fathers, like St. Basil, they say it's impossible to conceive of God apart from hypostasis and hypostasis of the Trinity. That means we're talking about something entirely different.
Yeah.
Right.
And so what's great about, as Jay had pointed out, it's not that just God, this generic idea of God, satisfies the necessary conditions. It's the whole worldview that has been delivered to us, the faith, the apostolic deposit of faith, that coherently and consistently makes sense of all the things that we just assume. And that's kind of one way to bring it down is that, look, we look around the world and we all come up with a story about how that makes sense. And, some people come up with different types of stories. But ultimately, it's a story. And we would call this a worldview or paradigm. And so when you look, rather than individual kind of statements, but you look at the story as a whole and you ask, does this make sense for accounting for the world of appearances? And you start to see that other people's worldviews can't make any sense. Again, you can't talk about, well, I believe in water, roofies, and Bill Cosby, and that's my necessary preconditions and starting points for the universe of cakes. It doesn't make any sense. So, for example, and I like to boil it down into this disjunction. A disjunction is when you can reduce something to an either or, like she's either pregnant or she's not. And ultimately, what is the world views? That if you're an atheist, the world is not intentional. It wasn't created on purpose.
Right.
It's an accident. Something that's non-intentional, there's no reason why the universe... Now, they might say it's a necessary condition, but that's different than saying it's accidental. And so there's no ultimate reason why, because it stops back. It's just some cosmic force that started it off, or it's eternal. But then think about how silly this is. Well, we all believe in the laws of physics and numbers. What do accidental numbers and accidental laws of physics even look like? Is that even a coherent thought?
Yeah.
You're going to tell me about all these reasons and for why the universe started from non-reason, there's no intentionality behind or reason behind the universe. There's no personhood. Then you're going to tell me about all these reasons for that. I mean, that's completely incoherent.
Yeah.
And so
can I stop you for a second? Yeah. So I want to ask something here to kind of get another concrete example. So you talked about the Masonic God, the deist God. So for them, well, I mean, Masons have obviously a very wide range of beliefs in God and who he is, whether he exists, etc. But let's say we go with the classical Masonic God of the one who winds the clock and then sets it down and walks away and never interacts with it again, right? So we're all just playing out along these laws of physics, but God doesn't personally intervene or interact with us. How, according to this paradigm you guys are presenting, would you say that does not make sense? How would you take down their argument for that God just sets the clock and wanders away?
Well, I would say that a deistic kind of argument usually leads people to atheism. I mean, it's at least intellectually possible to hold to the existence of a deistic deity, but it's not very coherent, and it doesn't usually hold people very long. Most of the time it leads people, and in the history of philosophy, it actually gradually led people to accepting atheism. I mean, deism just doesn't hold people very long because the God of deism is pretty irrelevant. He's just kind of a placeholder for how to maybe kick everything into being. But after Darwinism, the world kind of dispensed with the idea of the original Kickstarters. That wasn't even necessary because what Darwin wanted to provide was a purely natural account for the origin of life, biology, etc. So there could be deists out there that hold to the position, but it's not a very popular position. It doesn't hold, but it's a way to deal with the problem of evil sometimes, where people think, oh well, deism can at least give me the reason why bad things happen because that deity isn't really here. But when we start asking, well, why do we believe in a deity at all? Where does this deity come from? It tends to lead people again to atheism. So I would just argue that there's not really any good reason to believe that there is a deity at all with deistic presuppositions.
Yeah, it certainly won't lead to any kind of repentance or growth in morality, because if you think God's indifferent, there's really no reason not to just live as if you were an atheist.
Yeah,
so I can see how it would quickly just lead to the second phase of that.
And also, God remains a concept within the mind. So if God is either utterly so transcendent or absentee mechanistic cause that kind of wound it up, then you're in the same epistemic problem. That you're just, from your own starting point of your mind, locked within your mind, you're trying to reason out to this cause. But I'd point out that, well, that's begging the question that you can actually reason properly. How do we know that? For example, if my neurology and the constitution of my brain weren't correct, then perhaps I'd be schizophrenic and I wouldn't be perceiving. So I bring this out in my paper. Isn't it presumptuous to go, well, it is. I just know it is. Well, wait a minute. You can't use what's in question to then show that, well, this is how I know. If your mind is faulty. I mean, for example, are we constituted such that we can perceive reality correctly and know and reason about causality and get to this first cause of kind of deistic simply because we're different than schizophrenics? That's not a great argument for saying, well, yeah, therefore I apprehend reality correctly. And so what happens is, and this is why I critique natural theology of the West, is it just takes these things for granted, that you can start with your mind, just reason up to these things, but you're always locked within your mind, so that even when you get to the idea of God, it's not God. It's your concept of God. And the problem is that doesn't solve the problem of how you could actually know. And what's it's actually going to take is a personal God who actually not only can deliver the truth and solve this epistemic problem, but who is the truth himself.
Yes.
And he becomes one of us. So Justin Popovich says so we've got this gulf, right? We can never get to the other side of truth. And any appeal to our own reasons is just basically begging the question. It would be like saying everything in this book is true. How do you know that? Because on page 76 it said everything in this book is true. You can't do that. But this is what we're doing with all of Western philosophy. And then Western Christianity, especially scholasticism, takes on this project. They just beg the question and assume that you can do this stuff. And therefore, God always remains within concept. But St. Justin Popovich says, look, because we're not capable of bridging that gulf, the power of truth from the other side responds to the powerlessness of man on this side. Transcendent truth crosses the gulf, arrives on our side, and reveals itself, himself, in the person of Christ, the Theanthropos, the God-man. In him, transcendent truth becomes immanent in man. The God-man reveals the truth in and through him. He reveals it not through thought or reason. So there's the kind of apophaticism. He always remains beyond concept. But in a life that's his. And he not only has the truth, is one basically in a position to know he himself is the truth. In him, being and truth are one. And therefore, he in his person not only defines truth, but shows the way to it. And he who abides in him and Christ's life will know the truth, and that truth that is a life will make him free from sin, falsehood, and death. And so that's really the only coherent account that can actually solve the problem of knowledge.
Now, for those of you who are listening instead of watching this, Jay is holding up a whiteboard explaining the difference between the Christian personal God and the Platonic one or monad. So, Jay, can you explain what you're writing about over there?
Yeah, there's a great quote from Basil where he's having interactions and going back with some of the Hellenic philosophers and the Platonists who would at times say, well, hey, look, when you talk about the one, that Exodus 3:14, I am that I am the existing one, I am the one, that is the same thing that we mean by this original monad. So aren't we on the same page here? And what Basil stresses is that no, a monad is the number one. You don't have a relationship with the number one. You do have a relationship with this kind of deity who is the I am that I am, the personal God, the covenantal God who makes covenants with Moses. The number 7 doesn't make a covenant with you, right? Number 1 doesn't make but the personal God of Scripture, Exodus 3, does make a covenant, and he makes many, many covenants. And so that's what Basil kind of stresses in that famous quote. And the Cappadocians were, of course, noted mainly for making this really powerful distinction between nature and person, or between personal experiential existence, which is how we know God, as opposed to just merely essences or impersonalism, which is what the Hellenic world was associated with or obsessed with. And so that's why Basil just stressed that, look, this is a statement of personhood. When God says I, that's he. I, personal God, am. I am that I am. I am the one that is the ultimate circular argument. I'm the one that's ultimately self-referential. There's no other things that you can appeal to outside of me, versus the Platonic conception of the one being something impersonal, a number, right? And this is the way the Greeks tended to think. They did not have this notion. I'm not saying that when they interacted with people, they didn't think of them as people, but they didn't interact with the later Christian transformation of the concept of hypostasis to be personal. Many Orthodox theologians for many centuries have written on this point. In fact, in the Triads, there's an introduction to one of the chapters where St. Gregory Palamas says, he didn't say, I am it. He said, I am he, showing that he is the personal God and not the impersonal force of the Greeks and the Hellenists.
Now, how do you think that the Greek religions changed from that impersonal, indifferent monad into the more personal pantheon, the pagan pantheon, because it almost seems like they were moving in the right direction and the wrong direction at the same time, where the god or gods were no longer indifferent, but now they had become scattered instead of one. So like they went half in the right direction, half in the wrong direction.
Well, there's a lot of scholars have actually written on that topic of the progression of Hellenic and Greek thought. If you go back to like the Iliad, the Odyssey, in the Homeric period, they viewed the gods as, these, you could say, personal beings. Now, they didn't have this fleshed out concept that the Cappadocians kind of lay out for us by, their time. But yes, so they viewed the gods as kind of like, the actual individual personal deities. And what you get with the pre-Socratics and the Ionians and Plato and Aristotle is actually a movement away from the notion of actually existing personal gods and an abstraction. It moves in the direction of abstraction. And so the pre-Socratics, for example, start saying, there's not necessarily all these gods, maybe not, but maybe everything just is water, everything just is fire, everything just is matter, everything is atomism, everything is this, that. So they're looking for a grand narrative that is an abstraction away from gods, personal gods, you could say. So I wouldn't say that Christianity is like a moving back towards paganism in that sense, but it is true that if you look at the way Paul does his apologetic in Acts 17, he says that the living God made the world. The living God put Adam here and created the nations and their boundaries, right, and their times through his providence. And he rebukes the Greeks because they don't believe in the living God who can resurrect, precisely because they believe in these impersonal forces. He says the unknown God that you have an idol to, he says that's the real God, the one that you don't know. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he says that deep down in your nous, in your heart of hearts, you actually do know that God. So there's a mystery involved in the human person that at the same time as denying and rebelling against God, according to Romans 1, man deep down in his heart of hearts recognizes that there is one true God that he's in rebellion against. And so we don't have to do this huge amount of like philosophic legwork. Ironically, it may sound like what I'm saying is like a whole bunch of philosophy. It's actually not, because Paul doesn't do a bunch of philosophy legwork, right? He doesn't present a bunch of causal chain arguments in Acts 17 or in Romans 1. That's not what he does. And in fact, that alone proves that Paul's not teaching Thomistic natural theology. All he does is say that you're in rebellion, you need to repent, and he says that you can't. The world is chaos without right. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's true for everybody, right? So you have to repent to even interpret the natural world correctly. And I'm so glad Father Deacon mentioned St. Justin Popovich, because he has a whole essay on that very point, why we can't do natural theology, because there's no autonomous reasoning of man that can be done outside of the Christian paradigm. In fact, in the famous book, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Father Sophrony Rose's nihilism book, and the first chapter is nothing but a presuppositional critique of nihilism and materialism and atheism. And he points out how it's completely irrational, it's illogical. He says that the problem of man is not logic, but it's being illogical. And you can only be logical in the Christian worldview. That doesn't mean that the Christian worldview is synonymous with logic. But logic is something within the greater paradigm of the Christian worldview. It's a tool that God gave us, right? Christ reasoned, it says. He is the Logos of the Father, but he also reasoned with the Pharisees. He reasoned with them. Paul went and debated and reasoned with them. That's doing apologetics. That's doing logic, right? So it has a function. It's not everything. It's not definitional of God. God transcends created logical categories, obviously. But logic and creation are not therefore bad.
I agree with the point you made a second ago, that I think that people in their heart of hearts all do know that there is one God, because since we're made in his image and likeness, you can't get away from it even if you really want to. And not that we should look to Freemasons for theological wisdom. Obviously, I wrote a whole book refuting them. But even Albert Pike recognized in Morals and Dogma, he said man needs ritual and dogma, which for me is like liturgy and the church. We can't get away from it. Even atheists have their own sets of rituals and dogma. And speaking of atheists believing in God and you can't get away from it, I've always maintained that if you look at someone like Nietzsche, who claimed to be an atheist and yet has spent his entire life railing against God, right, I think that's kind of goofy. Like, why would you rail against something that you don't believe in?
Yeah, why even? Who cares? Why does it matter? Yeah. Exactly.
I think he believed in God more than some Christians do, frankly. He knew he was there. He was just really upset about it.
that's why Paul can say in Acts 17, to pagans, the word is near you, even in your heart. How could Paul say to pagans who haven't converted, the Logos is near you, even in your heart? He's talking about the fact that all men in their heart of hearts have a direct connect to the Logos. And so that's not to say that everybody's saved. I'm not saying that. But Paul is saying, as he says in Romans 1, in their hearts they rejected God. In their hearts they turned to idolatry. In their heart of hearts, which is the nous, and unbelievers have a nous, it's just that their nous is clouded. They haven't repented yet. So the nous is how we properly interpret not just scripture or revealed theology, but also the natural world, because as St. Maximus says, the content of the natural world is the logi, just as the content of scripture is the logi. It's one logos is the content of both the natural world and revealed scripture.
And speaking of logos, I did have that chat with E. Michael Jones about 4 months ago, right around Thanksgiving. And Jay, I know that you made a response video to a particular interaction that he and I had. In fact, someone created a whole YouTube channel just to attack me over those 5 seconds of the video. But in my follow-up to that video, I just wanted to clear the air.
That's not my channel, by the way.
Yeah, it's not Jay's channel. Some guy told me he invented the whole channel just to quote-unquote expose me. So that sounds like a waste of time, but whatever. So just to clear the air on that, even though I did already say this, I guess that guy missed it somehow. What E. Michael Jones said was that he was at a conference in Estonia where Russian Orthodox Christians were talking about Neoplatonism. Now, from where I was sitting in that conversation, obviously I've never been to Estonia. I had no idea what conference he was talking about. As far as I knew, some people who were calling themselves Russian Orthodox Christians had taken on some heresies of Neoplatonism. I did not realize until other people brought it to my attention, that what E. Michael Jones was actually talking about was the difference between absolute divine simplicity and the essence energies distinction. So just to clear the air again, hopefully there won't be any more YouTube channels about me created over this. I do believe in the essence energies distinction. I always have. I understand why absolute divine simplicity leads to what Jay has said before, is the idea that Christ was some kind of hologram, which is kind of the natural outcome of it. Because either you're seeing God's essence walking around there, or that's something else. There's no way around that problem. So I just wanted to clear the air on that. I was certainly not helping him, quote unquote, slander the church, which is what I was accused of and all that kind of stuff.
No, I know you weren't. Right. Yeah. No, I didn't have any problem with you. I just want to defend the against the what I thought was a bad argument from him. I have no problem with you at all.
Yeah. I mean, absolute divine simplicity it doesn't make sense
before.
when you think it through. Yeah.
Yeah, we've heard those arguments before, both Jay and I, that, and typically, I mean, I don't think anybody, maybe, and even E. Michael Jones himself would say that he's a theologian.
Oh, he would tell you that he's not.
Yeah, so good for him for saying that. But so typically this argument comes from people that are not savvy within the theology of the debates between the East and the West, and the typical criticism often is that, the Eastern Fathers and the Eastern Orthodox Church are Neoplatonists. So we've heard this before,
right?
And it's a silly straw man argument.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to insult Dr. Jones. I like Dr. Jones. I think he's a brilliant scholar on culture and politics. In fact, his new book I just got an email today. It's been shipped to me today. He just released Logos Rising. So I think we can have theological disagreements with people and still see, the good that we have in common. At least that's the view that I try to take on this kind of things.
Right, and I think he'd probably admit that too.
Yeah.
So one reason that I kind of obsess over this topic is just because I'm in the process. I'm trying to read through all of Maximus's writings in English to write this book for Father Peter here. So I'm really enmeshed in the mind of St. Maximus, and he's very important because he takes the doctrine of the Logos and the Logi in a much deeper way, or into a much deeper territory than many people prior to him even had done. So he's kind of the key figure for that topic. And the reason that I was objecting to what Dr. Jones was saying is because, and I've been on the same podcast as him for many, many years, Tim Kelly's podcast. So I've heard his position many times. I'm not trying to be unfair to him. It's just that I take issue with the assumption that Logos is a kind of impersonal force that is identical to all forms of law and order. So if I engage in logic and reasoning, that's Logos. Because we have to be very careful that Orthodox theology, because it's unique, is not confused with Hellenism, as we were pointing out with St. Basil and the One, right? So, and I'm not calling into question anyone's motives, because I made the same mistake. I remember 10 years ago, I thought logos in, say, Marcus Aurelius, hey, that's the same thing that John 1's talking about. Now, to be fair to him, Dr. Jones has qualified and said, no, I understand that the logos there ultimately is Jesus. So I appreciate that he has qualified that and made that more clear. It's just that we have to be very careful, for example, that we don't equate created logic or created categories with the uncreated. And so, for example, in the Logi doctrine of Maximus, the Logi have a created and an uncreated aspect to them. And so in the mind of God from all eternity, there are patterns, archetypes, principles, predeterminations, as he calls them, that are the bases for what he created. But they're not identical to God. They're not identical to the hypostasis of the Logos, because if they were, they would be necessary, because God is necessary. God's essence, God, who God is, that's something that can never change. God can't become something other than he is. He can't not exist, right? So what he is necessary. And so, because creation's not necessary, it was freely done, we can't equate these two categories. And this is just a mistake that what happens in the West is that Latin theology, what they call exemplars, they mean the same thing as Maximus about the Logi, but it's very important that we don't develop in the same way, because in the West, the exemplars become identified with the essence of God very clearly. There's no dispute about that in Augustine all the way up into Anselm does, I think, talk about the exemplars, as does Aquinas pretty extensively in many places in the Summa. But for our tradition is different. So from back to the time of Dionysius, all the way up through Basil, and specifically in St. Maximus, the Logi are not identical to the essence of God, because that would mean that the creations that they're patterned on are also necessary. But we don't believe that creation was necessary. It was always a free will decision of God. So there's this mysterious, in a sense, aspect to the Logi, according to St. Maximus, that they are thought wills that arise with God's decision to create. So in a sense, they're uncreated, but God's uncreated actions are not all the same. So St. Gregory Palamas in the Triads, for example, and against Barlaam in the debate with Barlaam, the Barlaamite, he says, not all attributes of God are the same. Not all works of God are the same, clearly, right? So Jesus walking on water is a miraculous action of divine power. It's the divine energy there doing that. That's not the same as creating the world. That's also not the same as the eternal glory of God. They're different actions and different things. And he says that if you look at any of the theophanies, God can even manifest as a theophany and disappear. He can come into time and space, and that action can have a specific instance in time and go away. And he says, well, how is that possible? That would violate the law of non-contradiction. And that's what the Barlaamite says to Palamas. Palamas says that because God transcends the logical categories, he's not bound by some rule that he can't step into time and space. And by the way, if he can't step into time and space in reality, for real, then he can't become incarnate, you see.
Exactly.
So the strictures of divine simplicity that the West eventually adopts, which apply not just to the beginning of the created order, not just to the incarnation, they also apply to the Logi. And so that's the whole reason why I just kept wanting to stress this point, is because I made this mistake. When I was looking at Orthodoxy, started looking at 2007, 8, I was like, oh, come on, man, this is crazy. The Logos of Heraclitus is the same as the Logos of Marcus Aurelius is the same as the Logos of John 1. And it took me a long time to learn that we have to be very careful, because we don't believe in the project of natural theology and Hellenism. That's the problem here. And I'm not Hellenism here, we mean the philosophic mistakes. We don't mean by Hellenism Greek culture or something like that.
So I have two questions about that.
By the way, go ahead.
So I'll give the mic back to you in a second, but I do want to ask these questions while we're on this topic. So would you say then, Jay, it would be safe to summarize St. Maximus's view on this as saying that logic and order and reason have logos inherent in them but are not identical with logos? So
think of something like the number 7 or any number or whatever. I believe what Maximus would say, and we actually kind of touched on this in the interview with Dr. Bradshaw, if you haven't had a chance to see that, because we took a lot of these questions to him and spent a lot of time talking to him over this matter, because I wanted to be clear on this, trying to write this book. I don't want to be wrong on it. So what I would say is, and I don't claim to be a Maximus expert. I'm just trying to work through it. But what I understand him to say is that there's a great essay of Father Florovsky that addresses this specific question. So if anybody wants what I think is the solution to this, read the essay Creation and Creaturehood by Father Florovsky. You can find it online. And what he says is just that if we think of the number 7, he says there's an eternal pattern, you could say, of the number 7 in the divine mind that we would call the logi, right? It's not identical to God's essence. It's, in a sense, a kind of thought will that God wills to be the case about the pattern of the number 7. The number 7 in the created order that we have in our minds, that we write on chalkboards, right? The instantiations or whatever. Those are created. So you can have an analogy between the uncreated and the created, right? They do match up to a degree. But also that what's uncreated still transcends what's created.
So this is the ideals and forms paradigm, isn't it?
It is, but there's a very clear transformation of the doctrine of forms or exemplars in Orthodoxy. This is what's key. And this is why, for example, the Synodicon of Orthodoxy condemns the forms. It says you cannot believe in Plato or Aristotle or their doctrine of forms. Not saying that they got everything wrong. It's just specifically saying that we don't believe Origenism and we don't believe the Origenist doctrine of forms, right, which is Platonic. We don't believe Plato either. They specifically mention Plato and his forms as condemned in the Synodicon. But we know that St. Maximus and all the fathers teach the logi. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the logi are not identical to the essence of God. They are works of God, but when we specify in what sense they're works of God that only pertain to the created order, and they have a created and an uncreated aspect to them. So there's a number 7. There's a logic that's applicable to the created order, human created logic. Does it signify and does it suggest the logos? Absolutely. It points directly to the uncreated. That's what we're arguing here with this transcendental argument type stuff, right? Is that, as Maximus says, it points us directly to the logos, who is the second person of the Godhead, right? So that's the solution, which I think Father Florovsky covers very well in that essay. It's just that there is a created and an uncreated aspect to them. But what happens in Roman Catholicism is that the uncreated and the created get confused, and they're placed in the essence of God.
Well, that's what my second question is. Given that Basil and Maximus are pre-schism saints, how did the Catholics get around these very clear doctrines of men that they have also canonized and venerated?
There's a development.
They tend not to read them. Yeah.
So there's different around it, I suppose.
There's different positions in Roman Catholicism. And this is what we've seen illustrated so well, I think, in the last few months with the interviews that we've done with former uniates and people who know uniatism. So in the uniate circles, they will say everything we say. But then in the rest of Roman Catholicism proper, the more heavily Latinized tradition, or the trads or the SSPX or whatever, they will completely have no concern for this stuff, or they'll reject it outright as heretical. So there's the thing they have to understand about the world of Roman Catholicism is that there's not one Roman Catholicism. There's multiple worlds of Roman Catholicism, and that's a huge mistake that people who haven't been in that world, when you have been in it, you know this. But yeah, there's not one Roman Catholic position on this, unless we were to try to be strict and say, okay, what does the Denzinger dogma say? I argue that there's a development in the Latin West of dogmatically defining a really strict divine simplicity. I think that's provable from the dogmas. I have a big essay on that, but that will be in the book for Father Peter Heers.
You know, I watched the interview between Taylor Marshall and that Orthodox guy who converted to Catholicism specifically over his statement that Orthodoxy was too diverse and Roman Catholicism was unified. It sounds like he might have jumped into that pool a little bit too early.
I think he's gonna find out the hard way, as I did. I mean, when I converted to Rome in 2003, I didn't know about the world of Orthodoxy, and all I knew was the Protestant Catholic stuff. And at that time on the internet, back in 2003, the internet wasn't everywhere like it is now, and there was limited access to stuff. I did get the Fathers set, so I started reading the Church Fathers, but I didn't know, for example, back then that so many of the claims from history for the papacy were forgeries. Right? It was many years before I learned that even the Vatican admits that many of these famous documents, the Isidorian Decretals, the Galatian Decretal, these are actually forged documents. So there's a lot of stuff that later comes to light that you don't learn back in 2003, 4, 5.
It's not part of their marketing campaign, certainly.
That's true, and it was also what I was immediately exposed to in the world of Roman Catholicism. I'm looking for the patristic church. I'm reading the Church Fathers. I read a lot of John Calvin and Luther and the Puritans, but I want the church of the first millennium, right? So in the world of Roman Catholicism, it's looking more and more like liberal Anglicanism or Episcopalianism after Vatican II. So I was immediately sort of presented with the problem of reconciling the pre-Vatican II and the post-Vatican II teachings. So what that led me into was just a whole world of, again, you could be, there's oftentimes this argument made that, what we have in Roman Catholicism is unity, and what you guys have is a lot of different bishops and opinions. But you could go to a big city. I've been in big cities where on any given Sunday, I was presented with the problem of, I could go to a Novus Ordo hip hop mass. I could go to a Novus Ordo Latin mass that was diocesan. I could go to the FSSP, which was not under the direct bishopric of the local bishop, but was a Latin mass in communion with Rome. I could go to the SSPX, which was supposedly in communion with Rome, but Rome didn't accept that communion because they're canonically excommunicated, still under the ban. I could go to a Sedevacantis mass, which does not recognize the Pope, right? And then there could even be other split off examples. So you've got within one city, supposedly what's unified, multiple different positions of people in and out of communion. It's a loose. It's basically on paper. Oh, the Pope, provides unity on paper, not in the actual. So anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but we have to stress, I think, the importance of, especially where the Roman Catholic Church is going with Pachamama and Amazon Sit-On. It's just going like light speed beyond Vatican II now. And
I saw this week the Pope is starting to, he started a committee to investigate the reemergence of female deacons. He wants to start that going up again. So, it only goes in one direction. The snowball doesn't reverse. It doesn't go in the other direction. And one of the many things I like about Orthodoxy is that the liturgy is the same in any language wherever you go. Unless you're in the Western Rite, it's a little bit different. And I like the Western Rite a lot too. Father Deacon, I was hoping to see you last time I was up at the Western Rite Church, but I guess you weren't able to make it that day.
Yeah, I apologize. It was nice seeing you there. Last time I got stuck with the service, so.
Okay.
And now we're stuck in our pods, so we can't.
Yes.
We'll have to pray that this quarantine released and we be able to see each other in the services again.
Wear the masks, eat the bugs, live in the pods, drink the soy. It's good for you, we promise.
Soylent Green, guys. Boys, Soylent Green. The delivery's coming.
So, Father, what was it that you were saying a minute ago?
So, picking up off where Jay left off when he was saying that, the logos that we talk about is not the same logos of Heraclitus. It's not the same logos of Aristotle and the Greeks. And when you have a theological project that embraces the pagan kind of philosophic project of that, well, we're all just talking about the same logos here. It's kind of this general universal thing that we all obviously agree with. And one of the negative consequences of that is the sort of perennialism and ecumenism that you start to see rising. I mean, if people ever wondered, like, well, where did this come from? It's
exactly.
Like it comes from embracing this type of philosophic project within one's theology. Then you're going to start saying, well, don't we just all worship the same God? We just have different ways. And you even see this within Christian communities, too.
That's Masonry in a nutshell is what you're describing right now.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That works really well with that, too. And I guess people don't see why this is. Why did the fathers, work so hard to fight against this? Why is the Council of Trullo and various councils condemn and warn against praying with schismatics, heretics, and heterodox?
Yeah.
It's because, again, it's not to say that there aren't similarities. But the problem is, when you look at it, it's not the same God. There's errors in there, too, that can creep in. And so, it's dangerous. So the church is trying to protect us.
Yeah.
That we really, just even in our conversation about...
Well, I believe in one God. He's Satan. I believe in one God. He's Satan.
They can do that.
So we all believe in one God. Can we just
that's why Christ said it's such an important question. Who do you say that I am?
Yeah.
That is the important question. And, you get this particularly among evangelicals that, quit dividing the brethren. We all worship the same Jesus. Really? Who do you say Jesus is?
Yeah.
From the Theotokos, the mother of God? No, the mother of... Oh, so you're an Nestorian Jesus.
Yeah. Not that they know what that means, but
no,
there's a big movement right now that they're calling the New Apostolic Revolution or the New Apostolic Reformation. And they got this guy named Todd White, who's you got dreadlocks down to the floor. He's like the biggest name in this evangelical world right now. He actually came to speak at my old Protestant church once, but I didn't go see him. He's an open historian. He says in his... First of all, he calls himself sinless, which is the biggest red flag, right? And then he also says in one of his YouTube videos, he says, well, Jesus wasn't born as God. He became God at baptism. And you're like, what?
Adoptionism, yep.
Yeah, where are you even coming up with this stuff from? So all they're doing is coming up with old heresies and reinventing them just because they don't know any better. So when I was becoming Orthodox, and I think there's still some truth to this, to what I'm about to say, but when I first started hearing the word heretic thrown around, it really irked me and it bothered me. It was like, these people are so mean. And some people are mean-spirited, but now that I'm deeper into it and I see, like when you're out of Protestantism for a couple years and you really understand, like you're soaked in the fathers and the councils, and you look back at it, it just looks like a disaster. So now I understand why that was all going on. And to Jay's point earlier about how when people say they can believe in one God, that might as well be Satan. Back when I was a Satanist and I was going on the Joy of Satan Ministries website, this old Angel Fire site, their whole paradigm was that Satan was the real God and the God of the Bible was this little evil usurper that came to oppress you and take all your freedom away. And from where I was sitting, sure, I could say, sure, I believe in one God too, but it was certainly not the right one.
And I want to make it clear too that because people always think that, well, heretic's an abusive word or heresy, that it's derogatory. Within the context of Orthodoxy, it means something very technical and specific. And that I'd encourage people that, look, this heresy isn't about, well, did I get all my theology exam correct? Can you imagine in seminary people and they get a bad grade on their seminary test, at St. Tikhon's, the professor isn't going to sign off C- heretic, right? It's not. It's not about getting all the theological check marks off. It really is a sin of disobedience and rebellion, in which one thinks that they're smarter and can figure all this stuff out, typically philosophically, by themselves, that they don't need the church. And so really our theology is not a systematic theology of, intellectualization and getting all this stuff. Somebody can know the truth of orthodoxy in their heart. In fact, the true theologian is the one who prays, and the one who prays is true theologian. This is the way that we do. Those people don't become heretics, even though they can't work out the essence, energies, distinction, and the explanation that we were given. Everybody has their own gifts. So perhaps Jay and I were trained in this, and we have certain gifts. Well, we use that. Everybody uses their own gifts. And what you see is those who practice the life of orthodoxy. And the life of orthodoxy, first and foremost, is repentance and humility. That they don't become heretics. It's the proud. It's the people like that. So I want to make that clear, that heresy is not an abusive word to degrade, your opponent or anything like it. It means something very specific, and it's a sin of pride and hubris and rebellion. And when one is excommunicated, it's not a punishment. It's a gift of grace and a call back to repentance.
Well, I appreciate that definition, and thank you for saying that. In fact, when I was becoming Orthodox, even as an inquirer, I wasn't still really a Trinitarian, and it wasn't until, obviously I was by the time I became a catechumen, and now that I'm on the other side of it, I understand how if you get who Jesus is wrong, you can't get anything else right, because, for example, if you don't understand that he's God and man, then theosis doesn't make any sense either. So it all comes back to what we were talking about earlier. Who do you say I am? Is he the indifferent monad? Is he the clockmaker that walks away? Or is he the personal God that becomes one of us to save us and make us by grace what he is by nature? And that really is the center of everything that we do. And I know for a lot of people, myself included at the beginning, they look at the church and they see all the icons and the fancy churches and the incense, and it can look like it's all about the rituals and little stuff. But really, at the end of the day, all of that is just pointing to one man, right? To the God-man. And everything else is an expression of that core belief, because it's like if you're flying an airplane, right, and your gauge is 1 degree off and you land 1 degree off from where you planned, the plane's going to crash and everyone on board is going to die. And so now I'm starting to see theology as kind of similar. Like, you have to get it right, or else you're going to end up in trouble.
I would add, too, that one of the things that really helped me a lot was just reading St. Gregory Palamas himself, going and actually reading the text and seeing what he said. And it's a little difficult, but if you stick with it, you can do it. It's not any of us who've been, reading any kind of other theological things, I don't think it would be too hard to get into these things, because it's important to see that St. Gregory is in the tradition of St. Maximus. He's not departing or saying anything different than St. Maximus. So when he talks about the energies, he's always looking back to Dionysius, to Basil, to Maximus, to St. John of Damascus, to St. Cyril of Alexandria, who has really clear statements on the energies, to St. Gregory of Nyssa, who is very clear on the energies. And so it's enshrined in our theology, particularly at the Sixth Council, particularly in relation to Christology. There's no way to be Orthodox on your Christology if you don't believe in the essence energy distinction. And if you read Book 3 of John Damascus, the exposition, it becomes really clear how he applies the essence energy distinction to Christ, especially in chapter 15. Like he's so clear, so precise, so unambiguous that there's really no way to hold to the Sixth Council, the debates that the Sixth Council had over this question against the Monophysites and so forth, and the monoenergists, without the distinction between the essence and the energies. And so when you move in a few centuries later and you read St. Gregory Palamas, you see that he's perfectly in continuity with what Maximus taught. And that's why the way our theology goes is not the same as the way the Latin theology goes. And the Latin theology goes, as we can see, a direct lineage from natural theology to this kind of autonomous reasoning, to, as Father Deacon has outlined, fides et ratio. It leads into this direction of doing the philosophy, which is the very thing that we're rejecting. So the problem is not being academic or scholastic per se. The problem is that thinking that those are the solutions to how we reach God. They're not. And St. Gregory Palamas is a great example of somebody who was studied in Aristotelian logic, who studied classical learning. And at the beginning of the book, The Triads, he can say Plato is demonic. Hellenism is demonic. That's in the first chapter. He says it's demonic. But at the same time, he says, I don't say that all philosophy is evil or bad. He says it has a place, but it's also, when you read these pagan guys, there's a lot of poison. So what I would leave everybody with is just that the whole point of what I'm trying to say, what Father Deacon and I are trying to say, is actually summed up in the recently printed St. Maximus Questions and Doubts. In question 136, he says, there's a question, is it possible that there's a natural proof of the Trinity? And if we think about Thomism, we understand that this is not possible in Thomism. The Trinity is a doctrine of revealed theology, not a doctrine of natural theology. So therefore, there could be in no way a natural proof or argument for the Trinity. There's always, to be fair to Thomism, they're not out of accord with one another. There's two circles of the natural revelation and the supernatural revelation, and there's the Venn diagram overlap there. But they're two different spheres of things, and you can never look out at the natural world and say the logi of creation teaches Jesus. Thomas can't say that given his other presuppositions. That's why, but Maximus can say, in contrast to that, all beings are believed to exist in three modes: in the essence and in the difference and in life. So he's looking at the created order and he's seeing a triadic distinction that exists in creation. We believe on the one hand that there is some essential being from the logos of the essence of beings, and this is the Father, right? So he's looking at creation and its origin and saying that the way that the creation has an origin is like the person of the Father. He says, on the other hand, there's an essential difference of beings. He says, this we liken to wisdom, the ability to make distinctions in things. The distinctions are really there. He says, this is like the Son, for the Son is distinct from the Father. He says, this wisdom imparts to each thing its own nature, and he says, a selfhood takes place. He says, and this is, he says, likened to the Holy Spirit. So this, he says, in the case of God, this triadic structure is inhypostatized, meaning it's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He says, but the created order, in that it has an origin, in that it has distinction, and then it has selfhood or identity or existence. He says these three features of the created order, he says, speak directly to the triadic origin of all reality. So basically, and there's other instances where he does this. He does this in question 105 about how there's not just a monad or dyad, there's also a triad. He says that reality has a Trinitarian structure to it. So he's basically looking at the entire world and saying that if we really understood creation as we're supposed to, we would understand that it manifests the glory of the Trinity. It directly teaches us the Trinity. And that's all we're trying to say, is that the natural world, all of reality, the logi of creation, whether it's logic, whether it's numbers, whether it's epistemology or whatever, all of that is teaching us the Trinity.
Well, it sounds like between the knowledge that the two of you guys have and the training the two of you have, this book is going to be quite a hit in our world, and hopefully it'll bring people out of different systems and different belief systems and get them more interested as well. So my final question for you guys, do you guys have a working title or a plan for where it's going to be published, like on Amazon or at Barnes & Noble or an Orthodox printing press or anything like that?
Yeah, Jay and I talked about this, that we could have went the route of the academic and have a kind of academic publisher. The problem with that is I'm thinking that it's not going to reach a large enough audience. And so, I wouldn't be opposed to using something like St. Vladimir's Press or something like that. But I think that we would have perhaps a larger audience if we just kind of make it non-academic publishing. I mean, we can always change our mind on that too. That sure. Because the goal behind this is to reach as many people as possible. Right. And to make as much money as possible. No, I'm kidding. Is that gonna make?
Books don't make money, by the way. Books don't make much money, by the way.
They don't.
Do you guys have a working title for the project?
I don't know that we do. Do we have one?
No, I haven't even. Oh, we need a title?
Well, if you want to be really apophatic, you could just not give it a title at all.
That's good.
Yes. So my first chapter is just blank. It's called Apophaticism, and then you open it up, and there's nothing there. There's nothing that can be really said.
Teaching by direct experience.
Yeah, it could be the first rule of apophaticism is you don't talk about apophaticism.
All right. Well, thank you guys for joining. We've covered a lot of ground today. I'm really looking forward to your book. And then after it comes out, I'll read it, and I'll have plenty of questions for you guys. If you'd like to come back and talk more about it, you're welcome anytime to the Brother Augustine podcast. So for the listeners and viewers, thank you all for joining us today. Make sure you check out and follow Jay Dyer and Father Deacon Ananias Sorum. They're on several different social media platforms, and they're very prolific, always creating new stuff, new content for you to enjoy. And I will see you all later.
Thank you.
Blessings.